Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're tackling one of the most popular and most misleading ideas in pop neuroscience. You've probably heard it before. We only use 10% of our brain. It's repeated in movies, articles, motivational speeches, even classrooms. But is there any truth to it? Or are we simply buying into a myth that sounds too good to question? In this video, we're going to break it down. What does this 10% claim actually mean? Why does it persist, despite decades of neuroscience that prove otherwise? And what's the real story behind how much of your brain you use and how well you use it? Because unlocking your brain's potential isn't about discovering hidden corners. It's about understanding the incredible machine that's working non-stop inside your skull and learning how to use it smarter, not harder. Let's get started. It's one of the most enduring myths in modern culture, the idea that we only use 10% of our brains. But what does that claim actually mean? And more importantly, is any of it true? To begin unpacking this, we have to ask a more precise question. Are we suggesting that, at any given moment, only 10% of the physical brain is active while the remaining 90% lies dormant like a forgotten attic? Or do we mean that we're only accessing 10% of our mental capacity, leaving the majority of our cognitive potential intact, like a supercomputer running on low-power mode? At first glance, these two interpretations might seem similar, but they are fundamentally different. This version of the myth imagines the brain like a machine where only a few gears are turning at a time, while the rest of the hardware just sits there, doing nothing. From a neuroscience standpoint, this idea has no foundation. Brain imaging technologies like fMRI and PET scans have shown that virtually all areas of the brain have a function, and most regions show activity even during rest or routine tasks. Even in sleep, your brain is astonishingly active. So the notion of a massive reserve of physically unused brain tissue is simply false. If 90% of your brain were truly unused, a stroke affecting that region wouldn't impair you, but it would, often severely. The second interpretation is a bit more nuanced and a bit more seductive. It's the idea that while our brain may be active, we aren't fully leveraging its capabilities. We go through life using only a small fraction of our true intellectual or creative power. This idea is harder to disprove outright, but it is still misleading. Yes, most of us can improve memory, focus, problem solving, our creativity through training, practice, and learning. But that doesn't mean the rest of the brain is asleep. It means we are not always optimizing the way we use our brain, not that we're ignoring entire neural networks. In fact, the brain is already an incredibly efficient organ. Its default mode is to conserve energy while solving problems with the least cognitive effort possible. You're not holding back untapped oceans of brilliance. You're working with a highly evolved, high-performance system that just needs the right conditions and habits to thrive. So no, you're not wasting 90% of your brain. That myth is based on outdated science and misinterpreted metaphors. What is true is that we can all benefit from understanding how our brain works, how memory forms, how habits are built, how emotions impact decisions, and learning how to sharpen the tools we already have. Because the real untapped potential, it's not in how much of the brain you use, it's in how well you use it. Let's start with the literal interpretation of the myth, the idea that we physically only use 10% of our brain tissue in everyday life. It sounds ridiculous, but some people try to justify it by pointing to a few extraordinary cases. For example, they'll cite children born with significant portions of their brain missing who still grow up to function cognitively within the normal range. Or they'll reference hemispherectomy patients, so children who've had an entire half of their brain surgically removed, yet somehow manage to lead lives that are, to all appearances, entirely typical. These examples are real. They're part of what makes the human brain so extraordinary in its ability to adapt, to rewire, and to compensate for damage, especially in young, developing brains. But here's the problem with this logic. Just because the brain can adapt doesn't mean that large parts of it are useless or dormant. That's like saying a car can still run on 3 tires, so the fourth one must be decorative. The brain is built with redundancy and flexibility, not waste. Neuroscientific imaging has shown us that nearly every region of the brain is active at various points throughout the day, from regulating your heartbeat and breathing, to managing attention, emotions, sensory input, and decision-making. Your brain is constantly lit up like a city at night, even when you're asleep. So no, 90% of your brain isn't just sitting around waiting for a motivational speaker to come along and activate it. It's working right now. Every second. The myth persists because we want to believe in untapped potential. But the real story is even more fascinating, not because we use so little, but because we use so much, and we're only beginning to understand how. Let's go back to one of the most fascinating chapters in neuroscience history when a pioneering neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield cracked open a new way of understanding the human brain. Penfield wasn't just any surgeon. He was working with patients suffering from severe epilepsy, and in many cases, the only viable treatment was brain surgery. But here's where it gets remarkable. To avoid damaging critical areas during these surgeries, Penfield kept his patients awake under local anesthesia because the brain itself doesn't feel pain. And then, using a small electrical probe, he began stimulating specific areas of the brain's surface, the cortex, to see what would happen. The results were nothing short of incredible. When he touched the motor cortex, the patient's hand or foot might jerk involuntarily like a puppet on a string, stimulating the somatosensory cortex triggered distinct tactile sensations, the feeling of being touched on a specific part of the body, even though no one had laid a finger on them. But most fascinating of all, when he stimulated certain parts of the temporal lobe, patients would suddenly hear music, smell scents, or even be thrown into vivid recollections of past events, memories they hadn't thought of in years, surfacing as if they were happening all over again. Penfield's work gave us one of the earliest functional maps of the brain. He literally charted which parts of the brain control movement, sensation, and even perception. And here's what this tells us about the 10% brain myth. If only a small fraction of our brain were actually used, Penfield would have hit a lot of dead zones. But instead, nearly everywhere he touched, something happened. A movement, a sensation, a memory. His work strongly suggests that far more than 10% of the brain is in active use, especially when you consider how much coordination it takes just to perceive, think, move, and remember. So, if you've ever believed the myth that 90% of your brain is just lying dormant, Penfield's discoveries should put that to rest. Your brain is alive with activity, even when you're at rest, and especially when you're asked to remember something, move a limb, or feel anything at all. But even as Wilder Penfield mapped out much of the brain's sensory and motor landscape, he noticed something strange. Not every area he stimulated produced a visible effect. In fact, there were plenty of regions where he applied electrical stimulation and nothing happened. No twitch, no sound, no memory, no reaction at all. This mystery gave rise to an unsettling question. Could it be that some parts of the brain are truly inactive, just there, like unused real estate? Was this the hidden proof of the 10% myth? Penfield himself entertained the idea, albeit cautiously. He speculated that perhaps there are regions of the brain we don't yet fully understand, zones that might be underutilized, or at least not easily accessible through the methods of his time. But here's the critical thing to understand. No observable response doesn't mean no function. It just means the function might not be obvious, immediate, or something we can easily measure through physical or verbal reactions. Much of the brain's activity happens behind the scenes, regulating hormones, monitoring your internal organs, processing complex emotional and social cues, integrating data from multiple senses to help you understand the world, planning actions you haven't yet taken, controlling your ability to focus, regulate emotions, or even daydream. The parts of the brain that didn't react to Penfield's probe may have been involved in functions that don't produce a clear output, at least not in the same immediate, observable way that a finger twitch or flash of memory would. And remember, Penfield's patients were already dealing with neurological conditions like epilepsy. So some areas may have already been altered, damaged, or compensating in ways we still don't fully grasp. So while it's tempting to say, look, there are unused parts of the brain, the real takeaway is this: absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Today, with modern imaging tools like fMRI and PET scans, we've come to understand that nearly every part of the brain lights up depending on the task at hand. Even while you're sleeping, your brain is always active, just in different ways. Then there's the story of one of the most iconic patients in the history of neuroscience, a man whose tragic accident gave science a priceless glimpse into the relationship between brain structure and behavior. Phineas Gage, a 25-year-old railroad foreman, was working in Vermont in 1848 when a tamping iron along pointed metal rod exploded upward through his skull during a routine blast. The rod entered through his cheek, passed behind his left eye, and exited through the top of his head, and somehow he survived. But what fascinated doctors and scientists wasn't just his miraculous survival, it was who he became afterward. Before the accident, Gage was known as responsible, hardworking, and well-liked. After the injury, however, his personality underwent a radical transformation. His friends described him as impulsive, profane, unreliable, and emotionally erratic, a man they barely recognized. The rod had damaged the prefrontal cortex, an area of the brain just behind the forehead that we now know plays a critical role in decision-making, impulse control, planning, and emotional regulation. Phineas Gage's case became one of the first pieces of evidence that specific brain regions control specific aspects of personality and behavior. It shattered the old idea that the brain functioned as a single, indivisible organ. Instead, it revealed a modular system, where damage to one part can drastically alter a person's cognitive and emotional life, even if they can still walk, talk, and perform everyday tasks. But here's what's even more important for our topic: despite losing a large portion of his frontal lobe, Phineas Gage didn't become unable to think or speak or remember. He didn't lose 90% of his abilities, just certain specific capacities. His case is proof not of underuse, but of specialization. And if anything, it shows how every part of the brain is doing something meaningful even if you're not consciously aware of it. Damaging or removing it doesn't free up space for genius, it often removes critical abilities you didn't even know were compartmentalized. The fact that Phineas Gage survived such a devastating injury is already a miracle of biology. But what puzzled the medical community even more was what he seemed to retain. Gage could speak, he could walk, he could recall facts, recognize people, and follow instructions. His intelligence appeared mostly intact. Only one thing had changed: his personality. He became impulsive, rude, and unreliable. Friends said he was no longer Gage, and yet the core functions of memory, speech, and perception remained. This led many to ask, if so much of his brain was damaged, why didn't he lose more of himself? At first glance, it might seem like evidence for the 10% brain myth, proof that large portions of the brain are extra. But the truth is much deeper and more revealing. Gage's case doesn't show that we use only a small part of our brain. It shows that the brain is specialized and that certain areas are dedicated to specific roles, like decision-making, emotional regulation, or impulse control. When these regions are damaged, those functions are affected, but the rest of the brain doesn't sit idle. Instead, it works in a complex, distributed network, constantly processing, integrating, and adapting. What Gage taught us is not that parts of the brain are unnecessary, but that some parts are more fragile to personality than to intelligence. and that the brain's plasticity, its ability to adapt and reroute around damage, can be surprisingly powerful. So no, his story doesn't prove that 90% of the brain is unused. It proves that every region has a role, and losing just a small part of that system can change a person entirely. Even in the 19th century, the case of Phineas Gage sparked heated debate. What exactly did his injury teach us about the human brain? His physician, Dr. John Harlow, painted a striking contrast between the before and after. Gage, once known as responsible, disciplined, and hard-working, had become, by Harlow's account, fitful, irreverent. Indulging at times in the grossest profanity, he became unreliable, impulsive, and indifferent to the needs of others. It was as if the moral compass and emotional filter that once guided him had been severed from his conscious mind, and yet his memory was intact. He could speak fluently, solve problems, and remember facts and people from his life. His intellect had not disappeared. What changed was something harder to define: his personality. This transformation forced early neuroscientists to ask, could the brain's anatomy really shape a person's character? If so, where in the brain does it reside? The injury had damaged the frontal lobes, a region now known to be central to social judgment, emotional regulation, and decision-making. But at the time, this was a radical idea. Some dismissed the behavioral changes as exaggerations. Others saw in Gage's case the first clinical evidence that the brain is not just a thinking machine but the seat of personality, morality, and identity. So, rather than support the myth that unused parts of the brain lie dormant, Gage's story tells a more nuanced and powerful truth: that every part of the brain matters. And when one part is lost, the consequences may not be a loss of knowledge but a reshaping of the very self. Phineas Gage's case did more than shock 19th century medicine. It became a turning point in our understanding of how the brain works. The iron rod that pierced his skull didn't just injure any part of the brain, it targeted the frontal lobes, the region just behind the forehead. What followed was not a loss of memory or language, but a transformation of his behavior, emotions, and sense of social propriety. This raised a question that still echoes in modern neuroscience: are higher functions like morality, decision-making, and self-control localized in specific brain regions, or are they spread out evenly across the entire brain? At the time, scientists were locked in a fierce debate. One side championed modularity, the belief that the brain is composed of specialized regions, each with a specific job. The other side supported equipotentiality, the idea that any part of the brain could take over the function of another, like a backup system. Gage's transformation gave fuel to the modularity camp. His intact memory but altered behavior suggested that the frontal lobes act as a regulator, a kind of internal brake system. TMING are primal impulses, and helping us navigate complex social situations. It was as though the rational conductor had left the orchestra, and the rest of the instruments began to play out of sync. Though modern imaging has revealed the brain to be far more interconnected than once thought, the frontal lobes remain central to what we call executive functions: focus, planning, inhibition, and social awareness. So rather than proving that the brain can function just fine with large parts inactive, as the 10% myth implies, Gage's case underscores just how precise and irreplaceable certain brain functions really are. In the early 1800s, a curious idea was sweeping across Europe and America, one that claimed to unlock the very map of the human mind. It was called phrenology, and for a time, it stood at the forefront of what was then considered cutting-edge psychology. Phrenologists believed that the brain was composed of dozens of specialized modules, each responsible for a specific aspect of thought, feeling, or personality traits like courage, ambition, maternal love, or destructiveness. But here's where it gets even stranger. These supposed brain modules were thought to leave physical imprints on the skull. So, by examining the bumps and indentations on someone's head, a trained phrenologist claimed to be able to read their personality, predict their behavior, and even guide them toward a better life path. For a while, phrenology was more than pseudoscience, it was a cultural phenomenon. Charts of cranial zones appeared in medical offices and parlors. Employers used it for hiring decisions. Some people even sought romantic advice based on the shape of their partner's head. And while phrenology is now widely discredited, it left behind a surprising legacy, because, despite its many flaws, phrenology was among the first popular theories to suggest that different parts of the brain serve different functions. And this sparked serious scientific investigation. Over time, careful lesion studies and modern neuroimaging would confirm that yes, the brain is indeed modular, but not in the simplistic way phrenologists believed. So while we no longer trust bumps on the skull to reveal secrets of the soul, the core idea that structure and function are linked in the brain remains a cornerstone of neuroscience. Where phrenology truly went astray was in taking a compelling hypothesis and pushing it far beyond what science could actually support. The early phrenologists believed that each mental faculty or personality trait was governed by a specific, localized module in the brain. So far, so good. This idea, in its most basic form, foreshadowed modern neuroscience. But then came the leap. They claimed that the more a person used a particular trait, say, kindness, aggression, or musical talent, the more that part of the brain would grow, like a muscle. And here's where it gets even more questionable. They believed those enlarged brain areas would press against the skull, creating bumps or indentations that could be felt and measured. In other words, they thought the shape of your skull was a map of your inner world. That's where the science broke down. Modern neuroscience has shown us, quite definitively, that skull shape has little to no bearing on brain function. The brain does not push outward in distinct lumps that match our personality traits. And the size of a bump on your head tells us nothing about how empathetic, intelligent, or brave you are. And yet, for decades, phrenology was taken seriously not just by the public, but by some scientists and physicians. It was used in hiring decisions, criminal profiling, even education and matchmaking. This misapplication of flawed science serves as a cautionary tale. When we overreach and mistake speculation for fact, the consequences can be widespread and deeply personal. But despite its pseudoscientific legacy, phrenology sparked questions that eventually led to real discoveries about brain localization, paving the way for cognitive neuroscience as we know it today. Despite the flaws of phrenology, one idea that survived and, in fact, became a cornerstone of modern neuroscience is modularity, the notion that the brain is divided into specialized regions, each responsible for particular functions. And while phrenologists were wrong to equate these modules with bumps on the skull, the broader principle they grasped had turned out to be partially true. In the second half of the 19th century, scientists began gathering compelling evidence that supported this modular view, not through head shape measurements, but through clinical observation. Neurologists started encountering patients with focal brain injuries, those caused by strokes, trauma, or tumors, and noticed a fascinating pattern. When damage occurred in specific areas, specific abilities were lost. For example, a lesion in the left inferior frontal gyrus could leave someone suddenly unable to speak fluently, even though their intelligence and understanding remained intact. This became known as Broca's area, named after the French physician Paul Broca, who in 1861 described this correlation in a patient who could only say one word. Not long after, Carl Wernicke discovered a different brain region tied to language comprehension. Together, these findings offered strong evidence that language was not distributed evenly across the brain, but rather localized to certain areas, a major blow to the idea that all parts of the brain could substitute for one another. This shift marked a turning point. Rather than viewing the brain as a homogeneous organ, scientists began to map it like a landscape, with distinct territories responsible for movement, vision, memory, emotion, and more. And while we now know that these functions involve complex networks, not isolated patches, the concept of functional specialization remains vital. Today, Functional magnetic resonance imaging fMRI and other brain scanning technologies have confirmed what 19th century clinicians first observed. Different parts of the brain light up during different tasks. Memory, decision-making, fear, empathy each recruits a unique combination of regions. And while there is no single center for most human abilities, modularity provides the blueprint for understanding how the brain works as an integrated system. On the other side of the 19th century neuroscience debate stood the theory of equipotentiality, the belief that most, if not all, of the brain has the same inherent ability to perform mental tasks. According to this view, intelligence or cognitive ability doesn't depend on specific regions doing specific jobs, but rather on how much brain mass is available. The more you have intact, the better off you are. The more you lose, the more compromised your mental abilities become. Regardless of where the damage occurs, this idea was grounded in early observations of brain injuries, the general trend that larger injuries often led to worse cognitive outcomes. It seemed logical at the time to assume that brain matter was functionally interchangeable and that its total volume was the best predictor of one's mental capacity. According to this view, the brain was like a muscle, its effectiveness determined not by where it was used, but by how much of it was engaged. Equipotentiality found some support in early animal research. Psychologist Carl Lassley, in the early 20th century, conducted a series of experiments on rats to study memory. He taught them how to run mazes, then surgically removed various parts of their brains. Surprisingly, he found that the rats could still run the mazes even when significant portions had been removed. He concluded that no single brain region was solely responsible for memory and proposed two principles. Mass action, the idea that the amount of brain tissue removed was more critical than which tissue was removed. Equipotentiality, that remaining brain tissue could take over the functions of damaged areas. These ideas painted a picture of the brain as flexible and redundant, capable of shifting functions from one area to another when needed. It seemed to support the idea that a large portion of the brain might be unused under normal conditions, ready to compensate in case of damage, but we now know that both perspectives, modularity and equipotentiality, contain partial truths. Opponents of the modular view of the brain, those who believed that mental faculties aren't tied to specific, isolated brain regions, interpreted Phineas Gage's story very differently. To them, his case didn't prove modularity. Instead, it was compelling evidence that the brain operates as a unified whole, with intelligence and memory distributed across the cortex. After all, Gage didn't lose his ability to think, speak, or remember. He could walk, talk, plan, and hold conversations. His cognitive capacities seemed largely intact. The only notable change, according to early reports, was a dramatic shift in his personality and social behavior. He became irreverent, impatient, and prone to profanity, so much so that his friends claimed he was no longer Gage. To critics of modularity, this was confirmation of their belief that the frontal lobes where the damage occurred didn't house isolated modules for language or memory or intellect. Rather, they argued that the brain was more flexible, and that other parts of the brain compensated for the loss. Gage's intact cognitive function, despite such extensive trauma, seemed to support the idea of equipotentiality, that the brain works collectively and adaptively, rather than in discrete, pre-programmed parts. This interpretation gained traction among psychologists and neurologists who believed that the mind could not be reduced to distinct compartments, each handling a single function. To them, Gage was living proof that the brain could reorganize, recover, and adapt. That even after a devastating injury, the rest of the brain could rally and allow a person to function, albeit with some quirks. Of course, the truth, as modern neuroscience suggests, lies somewhere in the middle. Gage's story doesn't disprove modularity, but it does hint at a profound truth. The brain is both specialized and adaptable. It contains regions that prefer certain tasks, But when those regions are damaged, other areas can sometimes step in, especially during youth or early recovery. You might argue that the literal version of the 10% of your brain myth is a leftover from the once popular theory of equipotentiality, the idea that all brain matter is created equal and mostly interchangeable. According to this outdated view, vast portions of our brain lie dormant, just waiting to be activated, and if we could only unlock these hidden reserves, we'd experience superintelligence, photographic memory, or some other mystical enhancement. It's an appealing fantasy. After all, who wouldn't want to believe that they're only using a fraction of their potential, and that greatness lies just beneath the surface? And during the 1950s, right around the time the 10% myth began to spread in popular culture, a pair of scientists were conducting research that seemed to support this exact idea. Psychologist Carl Lashley, known for his search for the physical location of memory, conducted extensive experiments on rats by systematically removing sections of their brains after they had learned to navigate mazes. To his surprise, even with large portions removed, many of the rats could still perform the task reasonably well. He couldn't pinpoint any one region responsible for memory. His conclusion: memory might not be localized at all, and maybe the brain was more flexible than previously thought. This idea that no single part of the brain is essential, and that its functions are widely distributed, reinforced the idea that most of our brain power lies intact, waiting for discovery. Simultaneously, Wilder Penfield's experiments, while showing some regions could be stimulated to produce precise memories or movements, also revealed areas of the cortex where electrical stimulation didn't elicit any immediate response. This silence was misinterpreted by some as evidence that these regions had no function at all. "See," they said, "here's proof that most of the brain just sits there, doing nothing." But as we now know, absence of immediate reaction doesn't mean absence of function. Some parts of the brain are involved in complex integrative tasks, long-term planning, inhibition, or emotional regulation functions not easily teased out with a single electrical jolt. Others are active only under certain conditions, like during deep sleep, future planning, or abstract problem solving. Still, this combination of misinterpreted scientific findings and wishful thinking form the perfect foundation for a myth that has proved remarkably resistant to reality. In a groundbreaking series of experiments in the early 20th century, psychologists Carl Lashley and Shepard Ivory Franz set out to uncover how memories were stored in the brain. Their method was direct, if brutal. They trained rats to navigate mazes in search of food, and then lesioned different parts of their brains to observe the effects. Surprisingly, what they discovered challenged the prevailing assumptions of strict localization of memory. No single lesion caused complete memory loss. Whether the damage was to the front or back, left or right, the rats could still often remember the task. The critical variable turned out to be not where the brain was damaged but how much of it was damaged. The more extensive the lesions, the worse the rats performed on the memory task. This led Lashley to propose two influential principles: equipotentiality, within certain limits. Any part of the brain can assume the function of another, especially when the original area is damaged. Mass action, the efficiency of the brain in completing complex tasks like learning and memory depends on the total mass of functional brain tissue, rather than the exact location of specific regions. These findings posed a serious challenge to the modular view of the brain, which held that specific cognitive functions were localized in precise, anatomical areas. Lashley's conclusion: memory was widely distributed across the cortex, a bold assertion in an era when the brain was still largely a mystery. However, we now know that the truth lies somewhere in between. Certain brain areas are indeed specialized, like the hippocampus for memory encoding or Broca's area for language production. But there is also significant redundancy and plasticity built into the system. This explains why some patients can recover lost abilities after injury, as neighboring areas reorganize to take over certain tasks. Still, Lashley's work had a lasting impact. It inspired a generation of neuroscientists to think about the brain not just as a machine made of isolated parts, but as a dynamic, interconnected system, one where complex behaviors emerge from distributed networks. And it's precisely these kinds of findings, along with misinterpretations of cases like Phineas Gage, that help fuel the myth that we only use 10% of our brains, when in fact, virtually every part of the brain is active in even simple cognitive tasks, long before the age of brain scans and neuroscience conferences. Almost a century before Lashley's experiments, a French physiologist named Jean-Pierre Flourens was already asking big questions about how the brain works. Working in the early 1800s, around the same time as Phineas Gage's famous injury, Flourens conducted a series of surgical lesion experiments on animals, primarily pigeons and frogs. He would deliberately remove or damage parts of their brains and observe what functions were lost or, surprisingly, what remained intact. What he found was counterintuitive and deeply influential. Even with significant portions of the brain removed, the animals could still perform complex behaviors. A pigeon missing large areas of its brain could still fly, eat, and even mate. A frog with just one brain hemisphere could still learn to avoid obstacles. These results shook the foundations of early brain science, which at the time leaned heavily toward the idea that specific functions resided in specific brain regions. Flourens proposed a different model, one in which the brain operated more like a general-purpose organ, with parts able to compensate for others when damaged. He believed that the cerebrum controlled voluntary movement, the cerebellum managed coordination, and the brainstem governed vital functions. But overall, he saw brain matter as having a kind of shared responsibility, where many parts work together to produce behavior. This concept laid the groundwork for what would later be known as equipotentiality, the idea that many parts of the brain have equal potential to take on different tasks. It's an idea that would echo through the experiments of Lashley, Flourens, and others, and it became a key piece of the myth that huge areas of the brain lie dormant, waiting to be unlocked. But here's the twist. While Flourens was right about some things like the brain's capacity to adapt and recover, we now know that his conclusions were too broad. The brain does have specialized regions, and removing them does have specific effects. Though those effects might be subtle or masked by the brain's plasticity, its ability to reorganize and compensate. So when people claim that we only use 10% of our brain, they're often unintentionally echoing these early theories, drawing on outdated notions of generalized brain function and forgetting the sophisticated complexity of neural networks and regional specialization that modern neuroscience has revealed. Despite supporting the idea of equipotentiality, that parts of the brain could compensate for each other, Jean-Pierre Flourens was far more nuanced than many myth spreaders give him credit for. He did not believe that all brain tissue was interchangeable or equally capable of performing every function. In fact, one of his most significant contributions to early neuroscience was his careful differentiation between the cerebral hemispheres and the rest of the nervous system. According to Flourens, the spinal cord, the cerebellum, the medulla, and other brain regions each had distinct and essential roles. He was one of the first to argue that the cerebellum, for instance, played a key role in motor coordination, while the brainstem was responsible for vital functions like respiration and heart rate. These observations would later prove to be remarkably accurate as modern neuroscience confirmed the functional specialization of these regions. Where Flourens applied the principle of equipotentiality was specifically to the cerebral hemispheres, the two large lobes that make up the majority of the brain's visible surface. He believed these hemispheres function as a unified whole, rather than a collection of distinct, modular systems. In his view, if one part of a hemisphere was removed, the remaining portions could adapt and take over its function, at least to some extent. And while this view helped seed the idea that much of the brain might be spare capacity, a belief that would morph into the 10% myth. Florenz himself was not promoting the idea that the brain was mostly unused or unnecessary. Instead, he was making an early attempt to understand the division of labor within the nervous system at a time when scientific tools were limited and theories were in flux. In short, Florenz's work gave rise to both valid understandings of regional brain function and unfortunately oversimplified interpretations of brain redundancy. And that fine line between scientific nuance and public myth-making is exactly where the 10% myth began to grow roots. So, where did the myth begin? While the origins of the 10% of the brain idea are murky, many accounts trace its earliest seeds back to the work of Jean-Pierre Florenz in the 19th century. Florenz was among the first to suggest that the cerebral hemispheres might operate more as a unified whole, rather than as a collection of specialized, independent regions. This idea of equipotentiality, that different parts of the cortex could compensate for one another, stood in contrast to the growing notion of a modular brain, where distinct regions have distinct roles. He distinguished between critical subcortical structures like the brainstem, cerebellum, and medulla, which he recognized as essential to survival and function, and the cerebral cortex, which he believed had more flexibility and redundancy. This distinction led to a tantalizing possibility: maybe only a portion of the vast cerebral cortex is truly needed for normal function, while the rest lies dormant, ready to be tapped over time. This idea was oversimplified and misinterpreted, transforming a cautious scientific hypothesis about cortical adaptability into a cultural myth about vast untapped brain power. The nuance of Florenz's insights was lost in translation, and what remained was a seductive idea that we're all walking around with 90% of our potential locked away, waiting to be unlocked. It's important to understand that Florenz never said we only use 10% of our brain, but the misreading of his work, combined with public fascination and a hunger for personal empowerment, may have helped plant the idea in popular imagination. What is the evidence that we do, in fact, use more than 10% of our physical brains, including all of our cerebral cortex, even when we're just being cognitively lazy? Great question, and an important one to debunk the 10% brain myth. Let's look at what modern neuroscience tells us about how much of our brain we actually use even when we think we're doing nothing. 1. Brain imaging says you use way more than 10% thanks to tools like functional magnetic resonance imaging fMRI and positron emission tomography PET. Scientists can now watch the brain in action in real time, and these scans consistently show that virtually all areas of the brain show activity at various times throughout the day, even during simple tasks like daydreaming or watching TV. Large networks light up, including the default mode network DMN, which is active when your brain is at rest. Tasks like reading, listening, walking, and even sleeping activate a wide range of regions across the cortex and subcortical structures. In short, there's no evidence that 90% of your brain is just sitting there idle. 2. Every region has a role, even the quiet ones. Some parts of the brain don't show constant obvious activity, but that doesn't mean they're unused. For example, association areas coordinate and integrate signals from multiple parts of the brain. Some motor and visual regions only activate in response to specific stimuli, but are absolutely essential when needed. Glial cells, which outnumber neurons, play vital roles in support, immune response, and neural efficiency. They aren't idle passengers. So while some zones may seem quiet at times, they're specialized, not unused. 3. Evolution doesn't waste resources. From an evolutionary perspective, it's highly unlikely that the brain, the most energy-hungry organ in your body, using approximately 20% of your calories, would have developed 90% of itself for no reason. If we only needed 10%, evolution would have phased out the rest long ago. 4. Brain damage tells the real story. If 90% of your brain were truly unused, brain injuries wouldn't be so devastating. But in reality, even small strokes or tumors can result in significant loss of speech, movement, memory, or personality. Disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and traumatic brain injuries show us just how crucial every part of the brain is. The fact that damage to any region usually leads to noticeable deficits is strong evidence that all of it is used. 5. Even during sleep, the brain is buzzing. You might think that at least during deep sleep, the brain gets close to that 10% threshold, but that's not the case either. Sleep involves complex brain activity, including memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and even problem solving. REM sleep, when dreams occur, is associated with increased activity in many cortical regions. Your brain never really turns off. Bottom line, the 10% myth is completely false. The 10% of your brain idea is one of the most enduring scientific myths in popular culture, but it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Modern neuroscience shows that you use 100% of your brain, not all at once, but over the course of a normal day. Different areas are active at different times, depending on what you're doing: thinking, moving, feeling, resting, sleeping, or imagining. The entire structure of the brain has a purpose. There's no junk brain. The human brain consumes about 20% of the body's energy, even though it makes up only about 2% of your body weight. From an evolutionary standpoint, this is enormously expensive. Natural selection tends to eliminate wasteful traits over time. If 90% of the brain served no real function, it would be a massive evolutionary liability, wasting precious resources for no survival benefit. But instead, the brain has not only remained large across evolutionary history, it's gotten larger and more sophisticated, especially in the cerebral cortex, where higher-order thinking happens. That tells us something simple but powerful: we use it because we need it. Even when we're not focusing on a task, when we're resting, daydreaming, or simply sitting still, our brains are far from inactive. In fact, a whole network called the default mode network (DMN) lights up. This network is involved in self-reflection, memory, planning, and even mind-wandering. It's active by default, meaning it's always doing something important when you're not doing something externally focused. This baseline activity shows that the brain never truly goes offline, and no major regions sit idle. Brain signals are constantly zipping back and forth, keeping our internal mental world running, even when it seems like nothing is happening on the outside. The idea that we only use 10% of our brain implies that the majority of our neurons are just sitting quietly, waiting to be unlocked like a hidden power. But neuroscience paints a completely different picture. No significant region is unused. All brain regions have defined roles. Even if they're not active all the time, damage to nearly any area results in noticeable deficits. The truth is this: we use 100% of our brain, just not all at once. Different regions work together in complex patterns, switching roles depending on the task, emotion, thought, or experience. It might feel like your brain goes blank when you're zoning out, lost in a daydream, or staring at the ceiling, but neuroimaging tells a very different story. The indisputable conclusion from decades of brain scans is this: even when you're doing nothing, your entire brain is alive with activity. You may not be solving equations or composing music in those moments, but your brain is far from idle. Regions across the cortex light up in synchronized rhythms, managing everything from autopilot thoughts and emotions, to memory consolidation, to planning what you'll say in tomorrow's conversation, even if you're not consciously aware of it. This is where the 10% myth collapses completely. If 90% of the brain truly went unused, fMRI scans would show vast areas of darkness. But instead, they reveal a symphony of activity across virtually the entire brain, even when a person is merely at rest. This means the default mode network is buzzing with thoughts about the self, the past, and the future. Motor, sensory, visual, and emotional areas remain in subtle dialogue. There is no part of the brain that just sits there, Like an unused room in a mansion. So the next time you hear someone claim we only use 10% of our brains, you can say with confidence, actually, we use all of it even when we think we're not. One of the strongest arguments against the 10% brain myth comes from those moments when things go wrong, when parts of the brain are damaged or missing. If 90% of the brain were truly unused, then damaging that vast dormant territory shouldn't affect us much at all. And yet, in clinical neuroscience, this simply isn't the case. It's exceedingly rare to damage even a small part of the brain without disrupting some aspect of mental life, whether it's movement, memory, speech, emotional regulation, or perception. Yes, there are remarkable cases of children born with severe brain abnormalities, some even missing entire hemispheres, who go on to live surprisingly normal lives. Or adults who recover function after massive brain injury, thanks to the brain's incredible plasticity. But these stories don't confirm the myth. In fact, they demonstrate the opposite. These individuals often struggle and require years of adaptation. The rest of the brain works harder to compensate for what's lost. And even when functionality returns, it's rarely identical to what was there before. These exceptions don't prove that vast parts of the brain are expendable. They prove how resilient the brain is, how it can reroute, adapt, and reassign tasks, but not without cost. So rather than suggesting that some parts of the brain lie dormant, these cases highlight how every region of the brain matters. When one part fails, others must step in, not because they were idle, but because they're capable of being repurposed. The myth misunderstands the miracle of neuroplasticity, confusing adaptability for expendability. Thankfully, the human brain is not rigid. It possesses a remarkable, though limited, capacity for plasticity, the ability to adapt, rewire, and even partially repair itself following injury or loss. This ability lies at the heart of our brain's resilience, and it's what enables stroke survivors to regain speech, amputees to adapt their motor maps, and children with missing hemispheres to still develop language and reasoning skills. But this same plasticity has also fueled a psychological reinterpretation of the 10% brain myth. Perhaps it's not that we use only 10% of our brain matter, but that we access only a fraction of our true cognitive or creative potential. We know that under the right conditions, intense focus, practice, emotional motivation, environmental challenge, pathways can form. Dormant circuits can become active, and even old patterns can be overwritten. This neuroplasticity is not infinite, but it's enough to suggest that most of us do not max out our capabilities. Our brains might be structurally active, yet psychologically underutilized. Think of it this way: you use 100% of your brain physically, but perhaps only a small percentage of its adaptability, imagination, and problem-solving potential is being regularly called upon. That's not a failure of biology, it's a call to action. The real tragedy isn't that we're only using 10% of our brain, that we believe that myth, and in doing so, underestimate our ability to grow, to challenge ourselves, and to become more than we currently are. To truly understand the potential and limits of our brain's adaptability, we need only to observe the lives of infants and young children. In the early years of life, the brain operates like a sponge, soaking in new languages, forming deep attachments, learning motor coordination, and absorbing the subtleties of emotion, rhythm, and expression. This remarkable flexibility is the hallmark of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience. During this critical window of development, neural pathways are forged at lightning speed, and unused connections are pruned away with precision. The brain is actively sculpting itself to meet the demands of the environment it's born into. But this very plasticity, the ability to change, is an infinite. And that's not a flaw. It's a safeguard. Imagine, for a moment, what would happen if your adult brain retained the same degree of malleability. You could gain new skills rapidly, but you could also lose the ones you already have. Stability is just as vital as flexibility. Your deeply embedded memories, your hard-earned abilities, your sense of self, these are anchored in networks that resist constant rewiring. And for good reason. Plasticity is not meant to replace permanence, it's meant to serve it. Without that stability, every emotional state, every new input, every fleeting suggestion could threaten to overwrite who you are. Your brain must strike a delicate balance between being able to change and being able to preserve. That's why plasticity declines with age, not because we're losing potential, but because we've reached a stage of consolidation. We've built the foundational neural architecture that allows us to think, create, connect, and reflect with depth. And while learning is always possible, the scaffolding must remain stable enough to support who we've become. So yes, the myth of only using 10% of your brain is just that, a myth. But beneath it lies a more nuanced truth. You use all of your brain, but you haven't activated all of your possibilities yet. When we try to grasp the power of the human brain through numbers, we quickly run into the limits of our own comprehension. Think about it, 86 billion neurons, each with the potential to form up to 10,000 connections with other neurons. That's close to 100 trillion steps, is a neural web of staggering complexity, far beyond what even the most advanced computers can replicate. It's a galaxy of connections inside your skull. But here's the thing, this isn't just a marvel of biology. It's a map of potential. Because each of those septic connections can be strengthened, weakened, pruned, or newly formed. They are plastic, shaped by every thought, every habit, every challenge, and every moment of stillness. So, do we only use 10% of our brain? Not at all. We use all of it, but not all at once, and not always intentionally. The real question isn't how much we use, but how well we use it, how often we challenge it, how deeply we rest it, how intentionally we direct our attention, our learning, and our emotions to rewire it toward growth. And that's the profound truth. Your brain is always active, but your mind decides how far you go. You are not limited by the 10% you've been told you use. You are limited only by the beliefs you hold about what's possible and the courage you have to try something new. Even though your brain holds immense potential, it comes with a caveat: use it or lose it. The neural networks that support complex skills are built painstakingly over hundreds or even thousands of repetitions. Playing an instrument, speaking a foreign language, solving advanced math problems, these are not talents you're born with. They're engraved into your brain through deliberate, structured effort. This engraving happens in your cortex, the part of your brain responsible for storing long-term knowledge and skill. But the cortex is a slow learner. It doesn't work like your hippocampus, which rapidly makes associations and allows you to remember a conversation or a place after a single exposure. No. The cortex is methodical, reluctant, and for that reason, the skills it houses are durable but also vulnerable. Because if you stop practicing, if you stop reinforcing those circuits, the connections begin to weaken. The skill begins to fade. And the brain, ever efficient, begins to recycle that neural real estate for something else. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Why 5 minutes a day may serve you better than 5 hours once a month. Your brain wants to know what to keep, and it takes your habits as the answer. So ask yourself, what am I training my brain to remember today? And what am I slowly allowing it to forget? Cells that fire together, wire together. This phrase, simple yet profound, sits at the heart of how your brain learns. At every moment of conscious experience, your neurons are firing tiny electrical impulses dancing across the intricate web of your mind. But the magic doesn't happen when a single neuron lights up. It happens when two neurons fire at the same time. This coincidence, this synchrony, is how your brain builds connections. When two neurons are activated simultaneously, the connection between them strengthens. The more often they fire together, the more tightly they become bound. This is how an idea becomes familiar, how a face becomes recognizable, how a habit becomes automatic. It's not repetition alone that rewires the brain, it's associative repetition. Learning is not just about doing something again and again, but about linking patterns, meanings, and consequences. Every skill, memory, belief, and emotion is formed through this principle of association. When you practice piano and hear the same note as your fingers press the same keys, you're not just moving, you're sculpting. Your brain is engraving circuits. When you recall a painful moment and it floods your chest with emotion, that memory deepens not just as a story, but as a felt experience. And so, the saying proves true across every domain of life. What you practice becomes what you are. The brain changes not only when we act, but when we think, when we imagine, when we feel. That's the beauty and the danger of neuroplasticity. You can wire yourself into strength, or into fear, into resilience, or into reactivity, into growth, or into stagnation. So choose your thoughts as carefully as your actions, because your neurons are always listening, and they never forget who you've trained them to become. We live in an age of quick fixes and shortcut promises. Hack your brain, they say. Unlock your hidden genius in just 7 minutes a day. But here's the biological truth. There are no shortcuts to skill. Not in the brain. Not in real life. While some parts of your brain, like the hippocampus, can quickly encode associations and help you form short-term memories, true mastery lives elsewhere. It lives in the cortex, the vast and layered landscape responsible for storing the knowledge, habits, and skills that define who you are. But the cortex is a slow learner, and like the hippocampus, it doesn't respond to single exposures or fleeting ideas. It requires repetition, deliberate, structured, and sustained. Skill is not just knowledge remembered, it's knowledge rehearsed. Not just stored, but reinforced. Not just learned, but lived. Every time you practice something, whether it's solving a math problem, riding a bicycle, or playing a violin, your brain reactivates specific networks of neurons. These ensembles, as scientists call them, are clusters of brain cells that fire together when that action or thought is performed. And with each repetition, those pathways strengthen. The signals between them grow faster. The effort becomes less. The action becomes natural. But laying down those tracks takes time. It takes work. And above all, it takes practice. So, no, there's no magical mental vault of untapped ability just waiting for you to discover a trick to unlock it. What's often mistaken as hidden potential is just untrained capacity. And the only way to turn capacity into capability is through effort. Neuroscience doesn't flatter our impatience, but it honors our dedication. It rewards those who show up again and again. Because every deliberate repetition carves the grooves of mastery deeper into your brain. And that's not a myth. That's how transformation happens, one neuron at a time. By the time you reach early adulthood, your brain is largely done forming. The scaffolding is in place, the connections are stable, and the architecture of your mind is more or less set. But that doesn't mean it's static. In fact, every part of the adult brain is in use. There is no dormant corner, no silent chamber waiting to be discovered. The myth of untapped potential falls apart when you realize how brutally efficient the brain is. Neurons are social creatures. They must be connected. And if a neuron finds itself isolated and used and needed, it dies. Not metaphorically, literally. This is how your brain enforces relevance. By the time you've reached adulthood, every square millimeter of your cortical real estate has been claimed. It's already doing something. And if you're not using a region for a specific skill, say, learning a language or playing an instrument, it doesn't just sit there, waiting. It gets repurposed, rewired, reclaimed by whatever activity is dominating your life. So, the idea of unlocking some hidden and used part of your brain is biologically inaccurate. The truth is more empowering and more demanding. You don't unlock new parts of your brain. You train them. You shape them. You earn them. And if you don't, someone else's brain will be using that same real estate to build something magnificent. In this sense, your brain is like a vibrant city, always active, always changing, and shaped entirely by how you choose to live. Not all brain regions are equally flexible. And not all moments in life are created equal, either. Some areas of the brain are built to adapt, to learn, to reshape, to rewire. Others are more rigid, stable, and resistant to change. And this difference becomes especially clear when we look at age. During childhood, the brain is a masterpiece in progress, fluid, curious, absorbent. It's a time when neuroplasticity is at its peak, allowing young brains to soak in languages, movement, motion, rhythm, and social nuance without much effort. This is when foundational skills like walking, speaking, empathy, and problem-solving are carved into the brain's architecture. And then, slowly, the scaffolding hardens. The pathways that are used most often become highways. The ones left idle, they fade. It's not that the adult brain can't learn, far from it, but it learns differently. It requires effort, repetition, and conscious attention. There are still windows of plasticity in adulthood, especially during moments of transition, crisis, or intense learning. But the truth is this: childhood is about laying the foundation, adulthood is about renovation. And while renovations are possible, they demand tools, time, and a willingness to disrupt the familiar. So no, we don't only use 10% of our brain. We use 100%, but how effectively we use it depends on when, how, and why we choose to engage it. Would you like me to continue with the next section or prepare the video outro now? That's why it becomes more difficult to learn complex new skills like playing the violin or speaking a new language fluently as we grow older. Not because our brains lose their power, but because the neural scaffolding has already been built, and repurposing that structure takes deliberate, effortful rewiring. In childhood, the brain is like wet clay, easily molded, endlessly shaped. In adulthood, it's more like marble, still sculptable, but only with great care, precision, and time. It's not impossible to master a new instrument or learn quantum physics in your 50s. It's just that the pathways for these abilities weren't prioritized in your younger years, so now they must compete with the deeply ingrained routines of your current brain. Plasticity still exists, but it's not automatic. It must be summoned with patience, practice, and persistence. And that's the real truth behind the 10% myth. It's not that we use only a fraction of our brain. It's that we seldom challenge all of it at once, while there is no evidence that we leave much of our physical brain idle. The real mystery lies in how much of our cognitive potential we truly access. And that's where individual differences begin to matter. Because your brain is not just an organ, it's a story. A living, breathing archive of the life you've lived, the challenges you've faced, the habits you've nurtured, the thoughts you've repeated. It is carved by experience, strengthened by repetition, changed by emotion, and wired sometimes permanently by what you pay attention to, over and over again. No two brains are alike, even if they share the same anatomy, because the wiring depends on how you've used it, and how you continue to use it. Every day, you are building your brain right now by watching this, by thinking critically, by reflecting, by learning. And that is the more meaningful truth, not that we only use 10% of our brain, but that most of us only challenge a small percentage of it, not because the rest is inaccessible, but because we haven't demanded more of it yet. The potential is there, waiting, but it doesn't come unlocked by myth. It comes alive through effort. What you choose to do with your time, what you rehearse, repeat, and refine has a profound effect on your brain's wiring and function. If you decide to spend 20 years mastering a musical instrument, your brain will change to support that pursuit. Neural circuits involved in fine motor control, auditory processing, memory, and emotion will grow denser, faster, more efficient. And yes, you'll almost certainly outperform someone who's only spent a year or two practicing the same instrument, not because your brain is inherently better, but because you trained it to be. This is the real secret of so-called genius, not that they were born using more of their brain, but that they chose to hone specific regions of it with extreme dedication over time. Your brain reshapes itself to match your life, the way you think, the things you feel, the habits you build, the skills you repeat, the stories you believe, all of these become etched into your neural pathways. And so, even though the 10% myth is wrong in a literal sense, it does carry a metaphorical truth. Most people do not challenge the full extent of their brain's potential, not because it's locked away, but because they don't ask more of it. And you could. You still can. But time is the real currency of the brain. Every skill you develop, every habit you build, every memory you form, it all takes time. And time is finite. So, maybe the real question isn't, are we only using 10% of our brain? But rather, what do we choose to use our brain for? Because with each hour you spend mastering one thing, you are, by definition, not spending it on something else. This is the bittersweet truth of being human. You don't get to do it all. And so, your potential is shaped not just by biology, but by compromise. You might never learn to speak 10 languages or play 5 instruments or master quantum physics. But you can become extraordinary at what you choose to give your time and attention to. And that is what makes your brain powerful, not because you unlock some hidden chamber, but because you honor your time and train your mind with intention. If today's exploration into the truth behind the 10% brain myth piqued your curiosity, there's a rich world of research and thought-provoking studies to dive deeper into. To start, Daniel Schachter's The 7 Sins of Memory provides a fascinating look into how our memories often fail us and why those so-called failures are actually necessary features of an adaptive ND. From transience and absent-mindedness to persistence and bias, Schachter explains how memory is less like a video recording and more like a living, shifting narrative. Roger Lewin's article Is Your Brain Really Necessary? Challenges long-held beliefs about brain function by exploring strange and incredible neurological case studies such as people living seemingly normal lives despite major parts of their brain missing. These stories push the boundaries of what we think we know about brain necessity and potential. We also owe much to early neuroscience pioneers like Jean-Pierre Flourens. His 19th-century experiments with animals laid the groundwork for the concept of equipotentiality, the idea that some regions of the brain, especially the hemispheres, could share or take over functions. This was one of the earliest sparks that eventually fed into the 10% myth. Moving into the 20th century, neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield made breakthrough discoveries by electrically stimulating patients' brains during epilepsy surgeries. His work revealed how certain regions control specific functions such as movement, touch, or memory. However, the mystery of unresponsive brain regions led to speculation about underutilized areas, another thread in the myth's fabric. For a deeper understanding of how memory can be manipulated or altered, the work of psychologist Elizabeth Loftus is essential. Her research on eyewitness testimony demonstrates just how unreliable memory can be, especially under suggestive questioning, raising critical questions about the fallibility of human recollection. Finally, studies like Sex Differences in Human Brain Morphometry and Metabolism by Murphy et al. Remind us that the human brain is incredibly diverse, and that variation across individuals, whether by gender, experience, or development, adds complexity, not evidence of dormant potential. These readings serve as a gateway into the fascinating terrain of neuroscience, where myths are debunked, and the brain's extraordinary capacities and limitations are gradually uncovered. So, do we only use 10% of our brains? No, we use all of it, even when we rest, when we dream, when we're doing nothing in particular. Your brain is active, constantly processing, connecting, rewiring. The myth may have been born from a misunderstanding of potential, not of the brain's physical capacity but of our psychological and creative potential. Because even though your brain is fully engaged, it's shaped by how you choose to use it. Every new skill, every new challenge, every new thought carves a deeper path into your mind's circuitry. But potential isn't passive. It doesn't unlock on its own. It's cultivated, grown, practiced. So maybe the better question isn't whether you're using 10% of your brain, But whether you're using your days, the hours, the energy, the choices you do control to grow into all that you could become. If this video sparked a new thought or gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey into the most complex, mysterious, and powerful organ you'll ever own. Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and take care of your beautiful mind.